Clara thought she was coming to sell a rundown cafe, but what she found was a place where second chances became a way of life. Welcome to our channel, where we write fascinating tales of people, places, and values. Be sure to like and subscribe so that we can continue creating the stories you love. Clara Hudson had always been a dreamer, but lately, her dreams had felt more like distant memories. After the unexpected closure of her small bakery in the bustling city, she found herself adrift, both financially and emotionally. When she received the news of her Uncle Louis's passing and the inheritance of his seaside cafe, her emotions were tangled. Louis had been a kind yet enigmatic figure in her childhood, the eccentric uncle who sent postcards with cryptic messages but rarely visited. The cafe, located in the sleepy coastal town of Seabury, was more of a question mark than a lifeline. Arriving in Seabury felt like stepping into another world. The town was charming but worn, with its cobblestone streets and salt-streaked shopfronts. The cafe, perched at the edge of the harbor, was no different. Named the Anchor, it was a quaint but tired building with peeling paint and a sign that swayed precariously in the sea breeze. Clara stepped inside, greeted by the smell of old wood and faint traces of coffee. The place felt like it had been waiting for her. Among the clutter in her uncle's small upstairs office, Clara discovered a shoebox tucked away in a drawer. Inside were 12 antique-looking keys, each carefully labeled with a single word written in Louis's distinctive scrawl: regret, forgiveness, hope, closure, and so on. The labels were intriguing, but Clara couldn't make sense of their significance. Alongside the keys was a note in her uncle's handwriting: "For the ones who seek, these will guide." It was cryptic, like his postcards, and offered no further explanation. At first, Clara dismissed the keys as another of Louis's eccentricities, something sentimental but meaningless. However, as she explored the cafe and spoke with the locals, she began to piece together a different story. The Anchor, it seemed, had been more than a cafe. It had been a gathering place, a sanctuary for the town's residents. And then there were the whispers about second chance nights. Your uncle had a way of bringing people together, an elderly man named Walter told her one afternoon. Every so often, he'd hold these evenings where folks could leave their troubles at the door. Those keys of his? They were part of it. Walter's words only deepened the mystery, but Clara was hesitant to dig further. She wasn't sure she wanted to get involved with the cafe or its history. Her original plan had been simple: fix up the Anchor just enough to sell it and use the money to restart her life in the city. But the shoebox of keys lingered in her mind, and the townspeople's quiet reverence for her uncle's work stirred something within her. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the keys held a purpose, one she was meant to uncover. The turning point came when she discovered a journal tucked behind a row of books in the cafe's back room. It was Louis's, filled with musings about second chances, cryptic anecdotes about the keys, and reflections on the cafe's role in the community. One passage stood out. "We all carry keys, some visible, some hidden. They unlock doors we've long ignored or never dared approach. My hope is that these keys will help others find the courage to turn them." For Clara, the journal was both an invitation and a challenge. The cafe, the keys, and her uncle's legacy suddenly felt intertwined with her own need for a fresh start. With equal parts hesitation and determination, she resolved to hold a second chance night, just as her uncle had. It was the only way to understand the keys, and perhaps herself. What she didn't know was that the keys were more than symbolic. They had a way of connecting to the very heart of those who held them. And as Clara unlocked the cafe's past, the keys would begin to unlock her future in ways she could never have imagined. Clara's decision to hold a second chance night was not one she made lightly. The idea of stepping into her uncle's shoes, or attempting to, felt both daunting and absurd. She had only been in Seabury a few weeks, and despite the locals' friendly demeanor, she still felt like an outsider. What did she know about giving anyone a second chance when she could barely manage her own life? Yet, the journal's words kept echoing in her mind, and the shoebox of keys seemed to beckon her every time she walked past it. Maybe this was her way of figuring out what Louis had been trying to do. Maybe it would give her some clarity, or at least a sense of purpose. Clara posted a simple flyer on the cafe's door and handed a few out at the local market. It read, "Second Chance Night at the Anchor. An evening of reflection, connection, and fresh beginnings. Saturday at 7 p.m. The response was tepid at first. Walter, the elderly man who had told her about Lewis's gatherings, promised to spread the word. Others smiled politely, but Clara caught the flicker of doubt in their eyes. Still, by Saturday evening, she found herself nervously rearranging tables in the cafe, placing candles in the center of each, and setting the shoebox of keys on the counter. At exactly 7 p.m., the bell above the door jingled, and Walter shuffled in, followed by his daughter, Sophie, and a handful of others. Clara tried to mask her nerves with a welcoming smile as she handed each attendee a blank card and a pen. She explained the premise. Write down something you'd like a second chance at, anonymously if you wish, and place it in the box by the end of the night. Then choose one of the keys. The keys don't open anything physical, she added, feeling a bit foolish as she said it, but they might help you unlock something inside yourself. The group exchanged uncertain glances but played along, some hesitating longer than others before selecting a key. Walter picked Hope, his gnarled fingers brushing the brass as if testing its weight. Sophie chose Forgiveness, her expression unreadable. A young couple took Courage and Trust. Even Clara decided to participate, slipping a card into the box and selecting Healing. The night unfolded hesitantly at first, the air thick with awkward silence. But as the coffee flowed and Clara's hastily baked pastries were passed around, the atmosphere began to thaw. Walter shared a story about a childhood friend he hadn't spoken to in decades and how he regretted their falling out. Sophie, to everyone's surprise, revealed her struggle to forgive herself for a decision that had strained her relationship with her late husband. One by one, others opened up, the keys in their hands serving as both symbols and catalysts. Clara listened intently, her own heart aching as the stories poured out. She hadn't anticipated how deeply personal and raw the evening would become. It wasn't just about the keys, it was about the courage it took for these people to lay their vulnerabilities bare. And though she felt like an imposter among them, their trust in the process fueled her determination to see the night through. As the evening wound down, Clara read aloud the cards from the box. Each one was a poignant snapshot of someone's hope for a do-over, reconnecting with a sibling, starting a new career, letting go of guilt. No names were attached, but the room felt heavy with understanding and solidarity. By the time the last card was read, there wasn't a dry eye in the cafe. When the group began to disperse, Clara noticed that many lingered longer than necessary, as if reluctant to leave the newfound camaraderie behind. Walter approached her on his way out, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You've done something good here tonight," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Lewis would be proud. That night, Clara stayed in the cafe long after everyone else had gone, replaying the evening's events in her mind. For the first time in a long while, she felt something other than defeat. The cafe, her uncle's keys, and the people of Seabury were starting to feel less like a burden and more like an opportunity. Maybe, she thought, this wasn't about stepping into Lewis's shoes after all. Maybe it was about finding her own path, one key and one night at a time. The success of the first second chance night left Clara both exhilarated and overwhelmed. She hadn't expected the depth of emotion the evening would bring, or the clear sense of community it fostered. The shoebox of keys, once just a curious relic of her uncle's life, now felt like the heart of the cafe. Each key seemed to possess a quiet gravity, drawing people toward it as if it truly held answers. Clara decided to keep the momentum going, organizing another second chance night 2 weeks later. As more locals heard about the event, participation grew. Each night, Clara watched as people connected with the keys and, in doing so, unlocked parts of themselves they had long hidden away. And each key came with a story. Walter, who had chosen the key labeled Hopes at the first gathering, surprised Clara by showing up early to the second. His usual air of quiet reservation had been replaced with something lighter. As they set up the tables together, He shared the results of his first second chance night. "I called up an old friend," he said, his voice unsteady but bright. "It's been nearly 40 years, but we talked for hours. It was like no time had passed. I don't think I'd have done it without that night." Stories like Walter's became common. Sophie, who had chosen forgiveness, confided that she had written a letter to her late husband's sister, someone she'd been estranged from for years. The young couple, who had picked courage and trust, revealed that they had been on the verge of breaking up before the event, but had decided to stay and work through their issues together. The keys seemed to hold a unique power for each person, and Clara's curiosity deepened. She began keeping a journal of her own, recording the stories people shared and trying to piece together how her uncle had chosen the words for each key. What had driven him to create these symbols, and why had he left them for her? One afternoon, while cleaning out the storage room, Clara stumbled upon a stack of old letters. They were addressed to her uncle and written in a variety of handwriting styles. The letters were heartfelt and raw, filled with words of gratitude and stories of transformation. "Louis," one letter began, "I don't know how you knew I needed that key, but it saved me. I finally had the courage to leave a situation I thought I'd be trapped in forever. I'll never forget what you've done for me." Another letter read, "You probably don't remember me, but I came to the Anchor 3 years ago during one of your second chance nights. You gave me the key labeled closure, and I didn't understand it at first. But now, after finally saying goodbye to someone I lost long ago, I realize how much I needed it. Thank you." The letters were a revelation. Her uncle had not only hosted these nights, but had also engaged with each participant on a deeply personal level. He had a way of seeing people's needs and fears, giving them the keys they needed to face their struggles. Clara couldn't fathom how he'd managed such insight, but she felt the weight of his legacy settle more firmly on her shoulders. One letter, however, stood out from the rest. It was unsigned and unfinished, but the handwriting was familiar. It was Louis's. In it, he wrote about his hope for Clara, how he believed she would find her way back to herself through the cafe. "These keys, Clara," he had written, "aren't magic, but they're a reminder of what we already carry inside us. Sometimes, we just need a little help unlocking it." Tears welled in her eyes as she read the letter. She realized that her uncle's work was not about solving people's problems, but about creating a space where they could find their own solutions. The keys, the nights, and the stories were tools for reflection, connection, and courage. As the weeks went by, Clara continued to host the second chance nights, each one more profound than the last. New participants brought fresh stories, and Clara's journal grew thicker with accounts of the keys' impact. Yet, she also began to notice how the nights were changing her. Listening to the townspeople's vulnerabilities and triumphs made her confront her own struggles. The key she had chosen, healing, sat on her bedside table, a constant reminder of the wounds she had yet to address. The cafe had become more than a place to serve coffee and pastries. It was a vessel for transformation, not only for the community, but for Clara herself. And as she delved deeper into her uncle's legacy, she began to see that the keys were leading her to something she hadn't expected, her own second chance. The second chance nights had become the heartbeat of the Anchor, drawing more and more participants with each event. Yet, as Clara watched others find their paths forward, she couldn't ignore the growing weight of her own unresolved struggles. Each story shared in the warm glow of the cafe's lights stirred something inside her, a longing to face her own regrets and fears. But unlike the townsfolk who eagerly sought the meaning behind their chosen keys, Clara kept her healing key tucked away, hesitant to turn it. One rainy afternoon, as the waves crashed against the harbor wall, Clara stood in the kitchen kneading dough for the evening's pastries. The repetitive motion usually calmed her, but today her thoughts were relentless. She thought about her failed bakery in the city, how it had been her dream, her identity, and how it had crumbled under the weight of mounting debts and dwindling customers. She had poured everything into it, only to walk away in defeat. Her reflection was interrupted by a knock at the back door. It was Sophie, her usual reserved demeanor replaced with a look of quiet determination. Sophie had been a regular at the second chance nights, often staying behind to help clean up and offering small words of encouragement to Clara. "Clara, you're always here for us," Sophie began, stepping inside and brushing rain from her coat. "But when are you going to let us be there for you?" The question caught Clara off guard. She stumbled over a response, brushing it off with a joke about how baking was her therapy. But Sophie wasn't deterred. "It's okay to need help," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We all carry things we're not ready to face. But you've created the space for us to let go of that weight. Maybe it's time you let yourself do the same." Later that evening, after the cafe had emptied and the candles had burned low, Clara sat at the counter with her journal open in front of her. The stories she had collected filled the pages, each one a testament to resilience and courage. Yet her own entry, a blank page saved for herself, remained unwritten. Clara thought of her sister, Rachel, who had reached out to her several times since her move to Seabury. Their relationship had been strained for years, starting with petty disagreements that had snowballed into silence. When Clara's bakery failed, Rachel had offered to help, but Clara had refused out of pride. Now, the distance between them felt insurmountable. With a deep breath, Clara picked up her pen and began to write. Her thoughts spilled onto the page in a torrent of words: regrets about her bakery, guilt over pushing Rachel away, and the persistent fear that she wasn't strong enough to start again. The act of writing was painful but cathartic, as if naming her struggles gave her a sliver of power over them. The next morning, Clara woke to a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in months. She placed the healing key in her pocket and walked to the edge of the harbor, where the sea stretched endlessly before her. She held the key tightly in her hand, its cool metal grounding her. For the first time, she let herself feel the full weight of her failures and losses, not as proof of her inadequacy, but as steps along a winding path. Returning to the cafe, Clara found herself dialing Rachel's number before she could overthink it. When her sister's voice answered, familiar yet distant, Clara hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "Rachel, it's me. I think I'm ready to talk." The conversation that followed wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. Rachel's words were cautious but kind, and Clara's apologies were halting but sincere. By the time they hung up, Clara felt lighter, as if the key in her pocket had unlocked something she'd been holding shut for years. Over the next few weeks, Clara continued to confront her fears. She reached out to a former colleague in the city who had always admired her baking skills, rekindling a professional connection. She allowed herself to imagine new possibilities for the anchor, blending her uncle's legacy with her own vision. The healing key never left her pocket, a quiet reminder of her journey. And as Clara hosted each new second chance night, she found herself more present, more open, and more willing to embrace the imperfections in herself and others. The cafe was no longer just a refuge for the townsfolk. It was becoming Clara's sanctuary as well, a place where she could rebuild, rediscover, and reclaim her dreams, one day at a time. By the time spring settled over Seabury, Clara had become both a fixture in the town and a keeper of its stories. The cafe buzzed with activity during the day, its hum of life spilling into the evenings for second chance nights. The keys had become an anchor for many, symbols of possibility and courage. Yet Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her uncle's intention behind them ran deeper than she had uncovered. Her curiosity piqued one quiet morning when Walter brought her an old photograph. It showed her Uncle Louis standing with a group of people, their arms slung over each other's shoulders in camaraderie. In the foreground was a table, unmistakably in the anchor, with a shoebox of keys resting at its center. Written on the back of the photograph were the words, "For the seekers of doors unopened." That was one of the first groups Louis ever helped, Walter explained, his voice tinged with nostalgia. He started this whole thing not long after moving to Seabury. Said it was inspired by something from his past, but he never shared the details. Always a private man, your uncle. Clara's heart quickened. She'd always known her uncle was enigmatic, but now it felt like his work had roots she hadn't explored. Determined to find answers, She turned to the stack of letters she'd discovered weeks earlier. Among them, she noticed a pattern. Several were postmarked from the same address in a neighboring town. Hoping for a lead, she set out the next morning with the letters in hand. The address led her to a small, weathered building that housed a community center. Inside, Clara met an elderly woman named Margaret, who recognized Lewis's name immediately. Margaret's eyes lit up as Clara explained her connection. "Your uncle was a remarkable man," Margaret said, leading Clara to a dusty filing cabinet. From it, she pulled a folder labeled The Anchor Project. Inside were notes, sketches, and correspondence, pieces of Lewis's early efforts to create what would become the Second Chance Nights. "Lewis believed everyone carries a key inside them," Margaret continued. "But most people are too afraid to use it. He wanted to create a way for them to see the possibilities they'd buried within themselves." Clara pored over the folder, captivated by her uncle's meticulousness. One page caught her eye, a handwritten list of words: regret, forgiveness, trust, courage, healing, and more. Beside each word was a short note, often tied to a name. Some were cryptic: courage, for the one who left and needs to return. Others were specific: closure, for Martha, to say goodbye. Margaret explained that Lewis had spent years observing and listening to people, crafting the keys as a way to reflect their unspoken needs. He'd tell them, "This key doesn't open a door, but it might open your heart." And for many, it did. Clara returned to Seabury with a newfound understanding of her uncle's work. The keys weren't just symbolic, they were deeply personal, rooted in the lives of the people who had come to the Anchor. Her uncle's journal suddenly took on new meaning. She spent hours rereading it, noticing references she had overlooked, mentions of conversations, fleeting observations, and quiet acts of kindness that had inspired him to craft each key. One evening, as she was closing the cafe, Clara found herself drawn to the shoebox. She lifted the lid, letting her fingers hover over the keys before selecting one. Purpose. Turning it over in her hands, she thought about what it represented and how Lewis had created it. Who had it been for originally? What story had it carried before landing back in the box? The next Second Chance night was different. Clara decided to share what she had learned about the keys with the group. She explained how her uncle had chosen each word with intention, weaving them into the fabric of people's lives. The room was silent as she spoke, the weight of her uncle's legacy settling over everyone present. Afterward, people approached the shoebox with a new reverence. Walter, who had long embraced the key of hope, told Clara he wanted to contribute. "I'd like to make a key of my own," he said. "Maybe it can help someone else." Others echoed his sentiment, offering words they thought might guide others: belief, strength, patience. The creation of new keys became a ritual. Clara worked with the townspeople to craft them, etching their chosen words into the small pieces of brass her uncle had left behind. The shoebox began to hold not just Lewis's original keys, but also ones shaped by the community itself. Each new key carried a story, and each story wove the Anchor more deeply into the fabric of Seabury. Clara realized that her uncle's legacy wasn't something static to be preserved. It was alive, evolving with every person who walked through the cafe's doors. One evening, as she locked up after a particularly moving Second Chance night, Clara glanced at the purpose key on the counter. It no longer felt like a question. For the first time, she felt certain. The Anchor wasn't just her uncle's legacy. It was hers too, and it was only just beginning. The Anchor had become more than Clara ever imagined. It wasn't just a cafe, it was a space where people found themselves, each other, and the courage to move forward. The Second Chance Nights had evolved into a tradition, and the keys had taken on a life of their own. Clara, once hesitant to embrace her uncle's legacy, now found herself weaving her own story into the fabric of the cafe. As summer arrived, the cafe buzzed with a steady stream of locals and visitors. The shoebox of keys had grown, now holding nearly 24, many created by the townspeople themselves. Each new key carried a story, a memory, a hope, a lesson, and Clara saw how they connected the people of Seabury in unexpected ways. What began as Lewis's vision had transformed into a collective effort, one that Clara was proud to nurture. But with the cafe thriving, Clara began to wonder about her own future. For years, her dream had been to run a successful bakery. The Anchor wasn't the glossy, high-end patisserie she had once envisioned, but it felt like home. The thought of leaving it, of handing it over to someone else, made her chest tighten. Yet, she also couldn't ignore the small voice inside her that whispered of unfinished dreams. One evening, after a particularly lively second-chance night, Clara lingered in the empty cafe, her journal open before her. The last key she had chosen, Healing, rested beside her, its brass worn smooth from months of being carried in her pocket. She turned it over in her hands as she wrote, "This place has changed me. I thought I was coming here to figure out my uncle's life, but instead, I've begun to understand my own. The Anchor is more than a cafe. It's a part of me. But I think I'm ready to start blending my past and my present, to find a way to honor my dreams while continuing this legacy. Maybe my second chance isn't about starting over. Maybe it's about building on what I've already found." The next morning, Clara woke with a sense of clarity. She spent the day sketching plans for the cafe, a new menu that incorporated her signature pastries alongside the cafe's beloved comfort food, a small display case for baked goods, and even workshops where she could teach others the art of bread and pastry. She wanted the Anchor to reflect both Lewis's vision and her own. The first step was reaching out. Clara reconnected with her former colleagues in the city, seeking advice and rekindling professional relationships. She also enlisted the help of Sophie and Walter, who had become her closest confidants in Seabury. Together, they worked to renovate the kitchen and create a new identity for the cafe, one that honored the past while embracing the future. The reopening of the Anchor was a town-wide celebration. Clara unveiled the changes with a mix of nervousness and excitement, watching as customers explored the new offerings and gathered for another second chance night. The shoebox of keys remained at the heart of it all, a reminder of what made the Anchor special. That night, Clara chose a new key for herself: growth. Over the following months, the Anchor flourished. Clara's pastries drew visitors from nearby towns, while the second chance nights continued to be a source of connection and inspiration for the community. Clara found a rhythm that balanced her ambitions with the cafe's soul, and in doing so, she discovered a sense of purpose she hadn't realized she was searching for. One evening, as the sun set over the harbor, Clara stood outside the cafe, watching the golden light reflect off the water. She held the growth key in her hand, its weight comforting and steady. The Anchor had given her more than she ever expected, a second chance not just to dream but to live her dreams, surrounded by a community that felt like family. As she turned to head inside, Clara paused, glancing back at the sign above the door. The Anchor. It was a name that had always meant stability, a safe harbor. But now it was also a beacon, a place where new journeys began. And as Clara stepped through the threshold, she knew that hers was just getting started. Thank you for sticking around until the end. Again, if you enjoyed the story, remember to like and subscribe and share this video with your loved ones.